Welcome to Armour and Ember. Tonight, we explore a question that challenges our understanding of historical succession itself. When exactly did the Roman Empire end? The conventional historiography tells us it fell in the year 476, when the last Western emperor was deposed by Germanic warlords. The archaeological record, though, reveals something far more complex. 1,000 miles east of Rome, in the magnificent capital of Constantinople, the Roman state continued, not as a memory or an echo, but as a living, functioning empire for another 1,000 years. Consider the physical evidence of this continuity. In Constantinople's imperial treasury, gold nomisma coins were minted with the same weight and purity standards established by Constantine. Each coin bore the emperor's image, struck from dyes that had been used for centuries. The imperial purple, that distinctive colour, created by crushing 10,000 murex shells from Tyre for a single bolt of silk, still draped the shoulders of Roman emperors. The fabric was so fine you could see through a single layer, yet so valuable it was worth more than most men earned in their lifetimes. In marble-lined halls where footsteps echoed off polished stone, scribes copied the law codes of ancient Rome onto fresh parchment. Their quill pens scratched through candlelit nights, the sound a constant whisper in the palace archives. The smell of beeswax candles mixed with the faint mineral scent of ink made from crushed galls and iron. In churches rising across 7 hills, priests chanted liturgies in Greek that blended Latin tradition with Eastern poetry. Incense smoke hung in the air like morning fog over the Bosporus, drifting through columns where light caught gold mosaics. The weight of Roman authority, the texture of imperial silk, the sound of hammers shaping marble into domes that would stand for 15 centuries. All of this endured when the West fell into fragmentation. To those who lived there, they were simply Romans Romaeoi in Greek. The empire that history books say collapsed in 476 did not collapse. It moved east like water finding new channels. It adapted as metal adapts in the forge. It survived plague that eliminated half its population, invasions from every direction, betrayal by those it called allies, and slow erosion, like waves against cliffs. How did it endure so long? What allowed its heart to keep beating when seemingly stronger empires perished in decades? Tonight, we follow Byzantium from Constantine's vision to Constantine's final stand. We walk through the Hagia Sophia, when marble still smelled of fresh cutting. We stand on walls that held back armies for centuries. We watch an empire grow smaller, yet somehow more brilliant, like metal refined in fire. If you enjoy these journeys into the material past, please take a moment to like and subscribe. For now, let the noise of the modern world fade. Settle in. Let's begin. On the night before battle at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine slept in his military tent north of Rome. Canvas walls rippled in the October wind, making shadows dance across leather campaign furniture inside. Outside, 10,000 soldiers tried to rest in their own tents, shields stacked, weapons leaning against each other. The air smelled of wood smoke from cooking fires, horse sweat, oiled leather, damp wool from soldiers' cloaks, spread out to dry after the day's rain. Constantine was 40 years old, a general who had spent his life in camps from Britain to the Danube. His hands bore scars from sword practice, from holding reins in winter campaigns, from the rough work of soldiering. He could sleep through thunder, through nearby skirmishes, through the constant noise of an army at night. This night was different. In his dream or his waking vision, accounts differ, and perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. He saw a cross of light above the sun. Not the brutal execution device Romans used on criminals, something transformed. Made glorious. The words came with it, written in fire, or simply understood, in this sign, conquer. The next morning, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi symbol on their shields. The first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek overlapped to form a monogram. Painters mixed pigments with vinegar and egg, working fast as dawn broke over the Tiber. The paint gleamed wet in early light when the army marched toward the Milvian Bridge. The battle didn't last long. Maxentius's army broke. Men fell into the river, dragged down by the weight of iron and bronze, pulled under by armour that became their graves. The river bore evidence of the struggle for days. Maxentius himself was lost there, his remains recovered later, identified by the purple he wore beneath his breastplate. Constantine entered Rome victorious. The empire that had persecuted Christians for 3 centuries would soon wear the cross on its banners. Constantine understood something the earlier emperors had not. Rome itself, the ancient city, lay too far west. Too many barbarian tribes pressed against its borders. The Rhine and Danube no longer held them back. Germanic tribes had learned to cross rivers, learned to fight in Roman formation, learned to want what Rome had. The old capital, with its Senate house where aristocrats debated in Latin, with its temples to Jupiter and Mars where incense still burned before marble gods, all of it belonged to a world that was fading. Constantine looked east. In the year 324, after defeating his last rival in battle, he travelled to the shores of the Bosporus, where Europe ends and Asia begins. There, on a peninsula jutting into the sea, stood the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Perhaps 30,000 people lived within its walls. Its main industries were fishing and collecting tolls from ships passing through the straits. It commanded the Bosporus like a fortress commands a mountain pass. Constantine walked the 7 hills overlooking the water on a spring morning when wind carried the smell of the sea. He could see fishing boats moving across the straits, triangular sails catching morning light. The water so clear he could see boat shadows moving across the bottom in shallow places. Behind him, old Greek walls crumbled in spots, limestone blocks worn smooth by centuries of sea, wind and rain. Goats grazed on slopes where brambles grew through ancient foundations. He had ruled the Roman Empire for more than a decade, first sharing power with rivals, then eliminating them one by one as emperors did. He knew Rome itself was no longer the centre of the world. Wealth flowed from the east now, silk from Persia, arriving on caravans that travelled for months. Spices from India, brought by ships that crossed unknown seas. Grain from Egypt that fed the cities. The legions that mattered defended the Danube against Goths and the Euphrates against Persians, not the Tiber. He stood on the highest hill and turned slowly. West, Europe stretched toward the setting sun. Thrace, Macedonia, Greece, Italy beyond the horizon. East, Asia, began across the narrow strait. Bithynia, Galatia, Cappadocia, and beyond them, the Great Plateau, where Persian traders brought goods from the Silk Road. North, the Black Sea, source of grain and furs. South, the Sea of Marmara, opening into the Aegean and Mediterranean, the Roman lake connecting all the empire's shores. This was the centre, where the world's roads met, where an empire could watch east and west simultaneously, control trade from 3 continents, build a capital that would last. The construction began immediately. Constantine stripped temples and cities across the empire to beautify his new capital. Ships arrived daily at the Golden Horn, the deep-water harbour on the city's north side, carrying columns of Egyptian granite, slabs of purple porphyry from desert quarries, white marble from Greek islands. Some columns came from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the ancient wonders, dismantled so its stones could serve new purposes. Bronze statues travelled from Athens, Alexandria, Syrian cities, heroes and gods who would stand in Christian forums, whether they wished to or not. The construction sites stretched for miles. 10,000 workers moved through the chaos each day. Stonemasons from every province, architects arguing in Greek and Latin, engineers calculating water flow for aqueducts, surveyors marking streets with string and wooden stakes. The hills rang with hammers on chisels, cutting blocks to precise dimensions measured in Roman feet. Quarries on the nearby Prince's Islands ran day and night, torches visible from the mainland after dark, the sound of cracking stone carrying across water. Brick kilns burned in a vast field east of the old walls, producing millions of flat Roman bricks for the walls, the churches, the public baths. The massive cisterns needed to store water for a city of hundreds of thousands. The kiln's smoke hung in a permanent haze. Workers' skin became grey with brick dust that worked into every crease. The walls rose first, a double line of fortifications running from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, cutting across the peninsula's neck. The outer wall stood 40 feet high, built of limestone blocks fitted so precisely that mortar barely showed in joints. Behind it, a second wall rose even higher. Behind that, the original Greek wall formed a third line. Towers studded the defences every 50 yards. platforms for archers, and catapults, positions from which defenders could rain projectiles on anyone trying to climb the stone faces. Constantine walked the construction site most mornings, purple cloak pinned at his shoulder with a golden fibula, bodyguards trailing behind in armor that caught the sun. He stopped to watch masons fitting blocks, his hands resting on his sword pommel, nodding approval or pointing out problems. He visited the brick kilns and came away coughing. He inspected the harbour works where workers were building docks that could accommodate 100 ships at once, their pilings driven deep into the seabed with pile drivers that rose and fell with mechanical precision, the impact making rhythmic thunder that echoed across water. In the centre of the new city, the Forum of Constantine took shape, a circular plaza paved with marble, surrounded by colonnades of red granite. In its centre, a column of purple porphyry rose 120 feet, topped with a bronze statue of the emperor, dressed as Apollo, rays streaming from his head. Inside the column's base, Constantine placed relics, fragments of the true cross brought from Jerusalem, the basket that held loaves during the feeding of the 5,000. Pieces of saints' bones wrapped in silk and sealed in golden reliquaries. The column smelled of fresh mortar and sea wind that never stopped blowing. Churches rose across the 7 hills, replacing temples to Zeus and Athena. The Church of the Holy Apostles, built to house the emperor's eventual tomb. The Church of Hagia Irene, dedicated to holy peace, its dome a smaller version of greater domes to come. Inside these churches, mosaics covered walls and ceilings. Tiny cubes of coloured glass and gold leaf pressed into wet plaster, creating images that glowed in lamplight, Christ blessing with his right hand raised, the Virgin Mary holding the infant. Saints with golden halos, faces frontal and eternal, staring out with eyes that saw everything. The hippodrome stretched beside the Imperial Palace, a massive stadium for chariot races that could hold 100,000 spectators on stone benches tiered up the hillside. The track was long enough for 12 horse teams to race. In the centre stood obelisks brought from Egypt. Pink granite carved with hieroglyphs no one in Constantinople could read anymore. Monuments to pharaohs whose names had been forgotten, their stone now serving Roman entertainment. The great palace sprawled across the southeastern corner of the peninsula, a complex of buildings connected by colonnades and gardens. Throne rooms with mosaic floors showing hunting scenes, pastoral landscapes, geometric patterns that led the eye toward where the emperor sat. Private chambers where silk curtains billowed in sea breeze. Libraries where scrolls and codices lined the walls, the collected wisdom of Greece and Rome preserved on papyrus and vellum. Bathhouses where senators soaked in heated pools while discussing politics and philosophy. Kitchens where cooks prepared meals for thousands, smoke from their fires visible across the city. On the 11th of May in the year 330, the city was formally dedicated. Dawn broke clear over the Bosporus, water reflecting pink and gold. Incense smoke rose from 1,000 altars, set up in forums and at crossroads. Priests in white robes chanted blessings in Greek and Latin, voices blending in harmonies that rose and fell like waves. The emperor walked through newly paved streets, wearing purple silk that caught morning light like flowing wine, the fabric so fine it was nearly transparent, layered to create the famous imperial colour. Behind him walked senators transferred from Rome, army officers in parade, armour polished until it shone like silver, bishops carrying reliquaries, civil servants clutching scrolls. The procession moved through the Forum of Constantine, past the great column where the bronze emperor gazed out at his creation. They entered the church of Hagia Irene, where liturgy was celebrated, bread and wine consecrated, prayers offered for the city's prosperity and protection, the smell of incense mixed with beeswax from thousands of candles, with faint scent of fresh plaster still drying in corners, with the stone smell of new marble cut from ancient quarries. When liturgy ended, Constantine addressed the crowd from the hippodrome's imperial box. His voice, trained in military camps to carry across battlefields, reached the farthest tiers. He spoke of Rome's eternal nature, how the empire was not a place, an idea, how that idea now had a new home. He spoke in Latin, though most of the crowd understood only Greek. Translators repeated his words in the language of Homer and Plato. The crowd cheered. For the emperor, for the new city, for the promise of stability after decades of civil war. Constantinople stood complete on the shore of the Bosporus. Not a replacement for Rome, its continuation. The weight of empire had shifted east, carried on ships across the Mediterranean, inscribed in fresh law codes, copied by scribes with aching hands, sung in liturgies that blended old Latin prayers with new Greek melodies. The city smelled of cut stone and fresh mortar, of incense from churches and salt from the sea, of bread baking in ovens built into apartment blocks, of fish frying in olive oil at harbour markets. It sounded like Greek and Latin spoken in the same marketplace, like hammers on marble still echoing from construction sites, like the calls of sailors unloading grain ships from Egypt, like church bells ringing the hours. The empire had found a new heart. It would beat, sometimes strong, sometimes weak, always persistent, until the spring of 1453, when Ottoman cannons finally stopped it. The maps were old. Their parchment crackled when Justinian unrolled them, edges splitting from being opened and closed too many times. He had been emperor 3 years now, long enough to memorize every coastline, every lost province. Italy stretched across the largest sheet, its borders drawn in purple ink that had started to fade. When I was researching Justinian's Reconquest, I kept finding references to these maps, to how he would study them by lamplight, his fingers tracing territories that hadn't been Roman for generations. It struck me that for a man born in Illyrian hills, where peasants spoke rough Latin and slept on straw, these maps weren't just paper, they were an obsession. The throne room smelled of beeswax and cedar. 530 AD, 200 years after Constantine founded this city, and half the empire was gone. Justinian's fingers always ink-stained. He annotated everything himself, traced Italy's coastline. The parchment was stiff from being rolled and unrolled countless times. Rome itself, the ancient mother city, belonged to Gothic kings now. Kings who wore trousers instead of togas, who carried swords, couldn't quote Virgil. Sicily, once the granary, paid tribute to Vandal lords in Africa. Carthage, where Hannibal had challenged Rome's destiny, served Germanic masters who melted down bronze statues to make weapons. The Mediterranean had stopped being Mare Nostrum, our sea. It had become a border between kingdoms that didn't remember what it meant to be Roman. Justinian was not born to the purple. His uncle Justin, a peasant soldier who could barely read, had risen through ranks on strength and cunning, eventually seizing the throne when opportunity presented itself. Justinian had grown up in those same rough hills, speaking Latin with a Balkan accent that court sophisticates mocked behind his back, sleeping on straw in military camps, eating soldiers' rations of barley porridge and salt pork. He had educated himself. Read the histories while other soldiers gambled. Memorized the names of every province Rome had lost, every city that had fallen to barbarians. Now, with the weight of the imperial diadem pressing against his temples, a golden band set with pearls that gave him headaches. If he wore it too long, he had the power to do something about it. The maps lay held flat by brass weights shaped like eagles, tarnished green with age. Italy, North Africa, Spain. The barbarian kingdoms were young, unstable, torn by feuds between rival chiefs. The imperial treasury was full, swelled by taxes from Egypt's grain and silk tariffs from Persian merchants. The armies were ready. Theodora entered the chamber. Her silk slippers made no sound on marble. Her purple robes rustled like dry leaves, the imperial purple that only she and Justinian could wear, that anyone else would be executed for touching. Her early years had been spent among acrobats and performers in the Hippodrome's circus, learning to survive in places where wealth and power gathered never stayed. She had risen through extraordinary beauty and sharper intelligence to catch an emperor's attention, then to share his throne against every protest from aristocrats who remembered her origins from the theatre district. She was 45 now. Lines showed around her eyes and mouth. Her gaze was still sharp enough to make senators nervous. When she spoke, they listened, though some aristocrats still resented her origins in corners where they thought no one could hear. She placed a hand on the map, rings, catching lamplight gold set with emeralds from Ceylon, rubies from Persia, pearls from the Indian Ocean. Her fingers covered Italy's boot. You want to take it all back? It wasn't a question. She had shared his bed and his thoughts for 15 years. She knew his dreams better than he did. It was ours, Justinian replied, not looking up from the map. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Underneath was iron. It should be ours again. The people in Italy don't remember being Roman. They've forgotten Latin. They pay taxes to Gothic kings. Then we'll remind them. He straightened, turning away from the maps. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, illuminating dust motes floating in air like tiny stars, catching gold threads in his robe. Belisarius is ready. The fleet is ready. The Vandals in Africa are weak, their king is old, his sons fight each other. One campaign, maybe 2 years, and we'll have Africa back. Then Italy. Theodora studied his face, seeing the determination there, the absolute conviction that what had been must be again. She had learned not to argue when he looked like that. The cost? We can afford it, for a few years. And if the campaigns aren't quick? Justinian returned his gaze to the maps, to Italy's coastline, to Rome marked with a small circle in red ink. They will be. While generals prepared for war, another project consumed Justinian's attention. In the centre of Constantinople, where an old basilica had burned during riots 5 years earlier. Riots that nearly cost Justinian his throne before Theodora convinced him to stand and fight. A new church was rising. Not merely a church, a statement in stone and gold. The construction site stretched across 6 acres between the palace and the main thoroughfare. Brick dust hung permanently in the air, turning the afternoon sun orange, coating workers' skin and clothes, until everyone looked like terracotta statues come to life. 10,000 workers moved through organised chaos each day. Stonemasons from Syria, where the best craftsmen lived. Bricklayers from Thrace. Marble polishers from Greek islands. Carpenters building scaffolding that rose like wooden mountains. Engineers arguing over calculations scratched in wax tablets. The noise was constant. Hammers on chisels rang out in rhythms that became almost musical high notes where workers shaped details. Deeper sounds where they rough-cut blocks. The bass percussion of sledges driving wedges to split massive stones. Saws scraped through marble with a sound like screaming, the blades lubricated with sand and water that ran milky white with stone dust. Foremen shouted orders in Greek, Latin, Syrian Aramaic, their voices carrying over the din. Oxen lowed as they strained against harnesses, pulling sleds loaded with marble blocks that weighed as much as 20 men. The marble came by ship from quarries across the empire. Green-veined marble from Thessaly, where ancient quarries had supplied temples for 1,000 years. Red porphyry from Egypt's eastern desert, where convicts worked under armed guard. White marble from the island of Proconnesus in the Sea of Marmara, where entire hillsides had been carved away. The largest columns came from the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders, dismantled to serve a greater purpose. Each column required a special ship to transport it, lying on its side across the deck, lashed down with ropes thick as a man's arm. The architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, argued daily over measurements and methods. They were mathematicians as much as builders, familiar with Euclid and Archimedes, capable of calculations that could predict how stone would bear weight, how stress would distribute through arches and pendentives. They stood at a drafting table in a wooden shed at the site's edge, their drawing tools, straightedges, compasses, plumb bobs, laid out on boards, smoothed with pumice stone. The dome they planned was impossible, everyone said so. No dome that wide had ever been built. The Pantheon in Rome was wider, its dome was concrete, and it had massive walls to support it. This dome would span 107 feet, and the walls beneath it would be broken by windows. 40 windows at the base, letting light flood in. The dome would seem to float on light itself, supported by nothing visible. It would collapse, everyone would perish beneath it when it fell. Anthemius and Isidore had worked it out on paper and in models built of wood and plaster. 4 massive pillars at the corners would take the dome's weight. Between them, arches would span the space. Connecting the circular base of the dome to the square made by the arches, they would build pendentives, curved triangular sections that transitioned from square to circle, distributing weight in ways that made stone seem to defy nature. The walls rose first, built of brick, each brick stamped with Justinian's mark. The bricks were thin, flat, Roman style, that had built aqueducts and bathhouses for centuries. The mortar between them was as thick as the bricks themselves, mixed with crushed tile that made it stronger, almost indestructible. Workers passed bricks up scaffolding in assembly lines. Masons laid them in patterns that had been standard since Augustus. Supervisors checked with plumb lines to keep everything vertical. The interior columns went up next. 8 pillars of green-veined marble from Thessaly, each one a single piece, 40 feet tall and 5 feet thick. Installing them required elaborate rigging ropes and pulleys, wooden frames, dozens of men pulling in coordination, while an engineer shouted the rhythm. The sound when each column settled into place was like thunder, a deep boom that echoed across the construction site and into surrounding streets. Crowds gathered to watch from nearby neighborhoods. Merchants closed their shops to observe. The columns rose one by one until all 8 stood like a forest of polished stone, their capitals carved with acanthus leaves and crosses, white Proconesian marble capitals contrasting with green columns beneath. The dome's construction began in 536. The wooden formwork, temporary support on which the dome would be built, took 6 months to construct. It was a feat of carpentry, a hemisphere of timber, fitted together so precisely you could barely see joints, supported by forests of wooden posts that filled the church's interior. The smell of cut wood replaced the smell of mortar and stone dust. Sawdust covered everything. Then the bricklaying began, starting at the base, working in rings that spiraled upward. Masons laid brick in mortar, mixed with powdered volcanic ash from the Pozzuoli region near Naples, the same material Romans had used to build the Pantheon's dome. The work was slow, deliberate. Each ring had to cure before the next could be laid, lest the weight of wet mortar cause collapse. As the dome rose higher, workers climbed scaffolding that swayed in wind blowing off the Bosporus. From outside, the city could watch the dome take shape over months. It emerged from wooden formwork like a butterfly from a chrysalis, a perfect hemisphere of brick that seemed to float above the rectangular mass of the church below. At its apex, 40 windows ringed the base, each one arched, each one glazed with translucent alabaster that would glow when sun struck it. On the morning the scaffolding came down from inside the dome, in the spring of 537, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. The wooden supports were removed piece by piece, workers nervous, engineers watching for any sign of stress or cracking. The dome stood. The pendentives held. Justinian entered the church before interior decoration was complete. Scaffolding still covered walls where artisans worked on mosaics, laying gold tesserae in patterns that caught lamplight. The smell of wet plaster filled the air, mixing with wood smoke from lamps and ever-present incense. He stood in the nave for an hour without speaking, neck craned back, eyes following the curve of the dome from its base to its apex, 180 feet above the floor. Guards waited at the entrance. Courtiers whispered outside. Justinian remained motionless, a small figure in purple beneath the vast space, until finally he spoke. "Solomon," he said quietly, his voice echoing in the empty building. "I have surpassed you." The reference was to Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, destroyed by Babylonians 1,000 years earlier, rebuilt and destroyed again by Romans. It had been the wonder of the ancient world. Whether the claim was hubris or truth, the Hagia Sophia would stand as proof for 15 centuries. Ships from Egypt brought more than grain in their holds. Rats nested among the sacks, hiding in shadows. In the fur of the rats lived fleas. In the specimens carried by the fleas lived a bacterium that would decimate millions. The plague arrived in Constantinople in spring of 541. It began in the harbour district where ships unloaded cargo from across the Mediterranean. A sailor became symptomatic with fever. His name is not recorded. He felt cold despite spring warmth, shivering in his bunk while sweat soaked his clothes. Then came the symptomatic swellings, characteristic of bubonic infection, masses rising in the major lymphatic sites, fever hot, rigid beneath the skin. The pain was terrible, a burning ache that radiated through his body. He perished within 3 days, delirious, crying out for water that did nothing to slake his thirst. His crewmates became symptomatic next, then the merchant who had bought their cargo, then dock workers who had unloaded ships. The contagion moved through the harbour's clandestine economies, the garrison posts at the docks, and the families living in narrow lanes where the city's next generation played. Within weeks, the disease had spread through every quarter of the city. The streets grew quiet. Markets that had bustled since dawn fell silent. Shops closed, their shutters latched from inside, though often everyone inside had already perished. The sound of funeral bells became constant through April and May, ringing from hundreds of churches, bronze notes overlapping, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with mourning. Then the bells stopped. There were too many casualties to ring for each one, and many bell ringers were lost in the towers where they had laboured. The fallen remained in homes for days before anyone dared collect them. The heavy evidence of the contagion lingered in neighbourhoods where families had lived and worked a month before. Those overcome by the contagion were gathered in courtyards, in porticos of public buildings, even in churches, wrapped hastily in whatever cloth could be found. Bedsheets, tablecloths, curtains pulled from windows. The burial grounds filled, then overflowed. Work gangs paid triple wages to risk pathogenic exposure, dug mass graves outside the walls. The fallen were arranged in layers, hundreds at a time, covered with quicklime to accelerate the burial protocols required by public health necessity. The great palace became an island of silence. Courtiers fled to country estates if they had them, or locked themselves in mansions if they did not. Halls that had echoed with conversation and intrigue, with the rustle of silk and tap of leather shoes on marble, now stood empty. Servants walked through them like ghosts, their footsteps loud in the quiet. In June, Justinian himself became symptomatic. The fever came first, making him burn as though he'd been laid on coals. He called for cold water, for ice brought down from mountains and kept in insulated cellars beneath the palace. Nothing helped. Then came the symptomatic swellings, rising like dark fruit beneath the skin, the pain so intense he could barely think. His physicians, the best in the empire, trained in Alexandria and Athens, could do nothing. They applied poultices that didn't work. They applied traditional Galenic remedies, inadvertently weakening him further. They prayed. For weeks he lay in his bedchamber, burning with fever, the swellings rising and falling as his body fought an enemy it couldn't see. The room smelled of the affliction, and Herb's physicians burned, trying to purify air, rosemary, sage, frankincense. Theodora ruled in his absence, making decisions, signing documents with the imperial seal, keeping the administration running with an iron grip that made strong men afraid to disobey. She walked empty corridors where courtiers had once jostled for her attention, her purple silk dragging across marble floors that reflected her image like dark mirrors. The emperor survived. His fever broke in July. The swellings subsided. He was weak, grey, 20 pounds lighter. Theodora had him moved to a summer palace on the Asian side of the Bosporus, away from the plague-afflicted city, and there he slowly recovered his strength while the disease burned through Constantinople. By the time the epidemic subsided in fall, perhaps half the city's population had perished. Some historians would later estimate the empire lost a third of its people in the plague years, though exact numbers are impossible to know. Villages across Anatolia stood empty, their fields returning to scrub. The armies in Italy, already exhausted from years of fighting Gothic resistance, lost so many soldiers the conquest stalled. Units that had numbered 1,000 men now counted 300. When Justinian's reign concluded 24 years later, in 565, his dream of restoring the Roman Empire to ancient greatness was incomplete. Italy was nominally Roman again, barely held against Lombards pressing down from the Alps. Africa was secure, its grain feeding Constantinople. Spain remained mostly in Visigothic hands. The plague had hollowed out the empire's strength, eliminated the taxpayers who funded armies, depopulated the cities that produced wealth. What Justinian rebuilt with such effort would begin to crumble as soon as he was gone. Yet monuments to his ambition remained. The Hagia Sophia stood complete, its dome a marvel that would not be matched for 1,000 years. The law code he commissioned, the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled centuries of Roman law into a systematic whole that would become the foundation of European legal systems. The territories he reconquered, though they would be lost again, proved the dream of Rome was not yet finished. The Arab fleet appeared at dawn on a summer morning in 674. 200 ships filled the Sea of Marmara, their triangular sails catching early light, hulls low in the water, packed with soldiers who had crossed deserts and mountains to reach Constantinople's gates. On the walls, Byzantine soldiers watched the fleet approach. They had seen this before in previous centuries, different enemies. Persians and Avars had brought fleets to these waters. The walls had held then, they would hold now. The Byzantine fleet sailed out to meet them, perhaps 70 ships against 200. It seemed hopeless. The Arab ships outnumbered them nearly 3-1. Their crews had experience. Their soldiers were battle-hardened from decades of conquest that had taken Syria, Egypt, North Africa. The Byzantine ships had a secret: Greek fire. The exact composition is still unknown today. The Byzantines never wrote it down, or if they did, those documents were destroyed when the empire fell. Contemporary accounts describe a mixture that included naphtha, a petroleum product, possibly quicklime that ignited on contact with water, perhaps sulfur, maybe saltpeter. The result was a liquid that burned ferociously. Water couldn't extinguish it. In fact, water made it burn hotter, spreading it across waves like hellfire on the surface of the sea. The mixture was loaded into bronze tubes, mounted at the prows of Byzantine ships, tubes called siphons, reinforced to withstand heat and pressure. When the Byzantine fleet closed distance with Arab ships, sailors pumped the Greek fire through siphons using brass plungers. The liquid shot out under pressure. As it left the tube, it was ignited by a flame held at the opening. A jet of orange flame, 30 feet long, shot across water, splashing against Arab ships' wooden hulls, clinging to timber, burning with heat that made air shimmer. The odour was overwhelming: burning oil, sulphur, the acrid scent of naphtha mixing with smoke. Arab sailors jumped overboard to escape flames. The fire followed them into water, floating on the surface, burning their skin. The Arab fleet broke. Ships tried to retreat, wind was against them. Byzantine ships pursued, projecting Greek fire across the water, transforming the Sea of Marmara into unprecedented naval devastation. Burning ships drifted, their crews abandoned or perished, timbers crackling as fire consumed them. The water itself seemed to burn, patches of flame floating on the surface where Greek fire had spread. Smoke rose in black columns, visible from miles away, carrying smoke from burning ships across the Bosporus. The siege broke. The Arab fleet withdrew, what was left of it, sailing back towards Syria, with stories of Roman fire that burned water itself. They would not attempt another attack on Constantinople for decades. When they did, they would remember the fire and approach with dread. Greek fire saved the empire. For centuries it remained the ultimate weapon, used sparingly, saved for desperate moments when the city itself was threatened. The secret of its manufacture passed from one generation of chemists to the next, always in whispers, always under guard. When the empire finally fell in 1453, the secret perished with it. Modern attempts to recreate Greek fire have only approximated its effects. The exact formula was lost, like so much else, in the city's final burning. While Greek fire defended the sea, a different innovation protected the empire's vast land borders. The old Roman system of professional legions, soldiers who served for wages and retired on pensions, had become too expensive. The plague had eliminated too many taxpayers. Constant wars had drained the treasury. The empire needed a new way to defend itself. Something sustainable, something that tied defence directly to the land being defended. The theme system emerged gradually through the 7th century. The empire was divided into military districts called themes, from the Greek word for regiment. Each theme was governed by a military commander, who also served as civil administrator. Each soldier in a theme was granted land not as a gift, as a responsibility. In the theme of Anatolia, the largest and most important, thousands of soldier farmers worked plots granted by the emperor. A typical grant might be 50 acres, enough to support a family, grow wheat and barley, keep some sheep, maintain a small vineyard. The land was hereditary, passing from father to son. It came with an obligation. When the empire called, the men of the family had to serve, bringing their own weapons, armour, and horses. In a village in central Anatolia, far from Constantinople, a farmer named Georgios worked his land, as his father had, and his grandfather before that. His hands were calloused from the plough, shoulders strong from swinging a scythe through wheat fields in summer heat. He owned a suit of mail that hung in his house, wrapped in oiled cloth to prevent rust, a helmet that had been his father's. A sword and spear kept sharp in case of need. Every spring he spent a month in training with other men from the theme, practicing formations, riding manoeuvres, archery. The rest of the year, he farmed. When raiders came, Arabs probing north from Syria, or Bulgars sweeping down from the steppe, the theme system activated like a body responding to a wound. Beacon fires lit on hilltops, one after another, carrying warning across hundreds of miles in a single night. Messengers rode from village to village. Within days, the farmers became soldiers, taking down their armour, kissing their wives and heirs, gathering at assembly points where they formed into units that had trained together for years. They fought with desperation of men who had everything to lose. If the border broke, it was their fields that would burn, their villages that would be looted, their families that would face captivity. So they fought with a ferocity that professional soldiers, fighting for wages in distant lands, could never match. After the battle, after driving the raiders back, they returned to their fields and finished the harvest, repaired irrigation ditches, pruned olive trees. This system sustained the empire through centuries when it had no money to hire mercenaries, when its cities were shrinking, when civilization itself seemed to be contracting. The themes were self-sufficient, resilient, deeply rooted in the landscape. They couldn't conquer distant territories that required professional armies, logistics, sustained campaigns. They could hold the line, protect what remained, endure. In the Great Palace, in a throne room designed to awe and intimidate, the Byzantine Empire practiced another art of survival. Diplomacy raised to the level of performance. Negotiation as theatre. Words and gifts deployed as carefully as armies. When foreign ambassadors arrived in Constantinople, they entered a world deliberately constructed to overwhelm them. The journey from harbour to palace took them through streets cleaned and decorated for the occasion, past forums where fountains played and merchants displayed exotic goods from across the world. Guards in ceremonial armour lined the route, their equipment polished until it shone, their horses groomed until coats gleamed. The impression was wealth, power, invincibility. At the palace, ambassadors were led through a maze of corridors and courtyards, each more impressive than the last. Mosaic floors showed hunting scenes, pastoral landscapes, geometric patterns that led the eye forward toward the throne room. The walls were hung with silk, purple silk, that only the emperor could wear or give as gifts. Silk worth its weight in gold. The smell of incense drifted from censers, burning in alcoves, where icons glowed with gold leaf that caught lamplight. In the throne room itself, built in the 6th century and modified by successive emperors, every element was calculated. The floor was polished marble, in alternating black and white squares like a chessboard. The walls were covered in mosaics showing Christ crowning the emperor, asserting divine approval. At the far end, on a platform raised 12 steps above the floor, sat the Chrysotraklinos, the golden chamber throne, made of gold and studded with gems that caught light from high windows. Flanking the throne were 2 mechanical lions, life-sized, made of gilded bronze, their mouths set with crystal teeth. To either side stood golden trees, where mechanical birds perched among jewelled leaves. All of this was hidden at first behind silk curtains. When ambassadors entered, the curtains parted. They prostrated themselves, that was the protocol, lying flat on the floor, foreheads touching marble. When they were allowed to rise and approach, the mechanical spectacle began. The lions roared bronze mechanisms inside their bodies, producing sounds that echoed through the chamber. Their tails lashed. The birds in the trees sang, each one producing a different mechanical chirp through hidden pipes. The throne itself began to rise, lifted by hydraulic machinery hidden beneath the platform, carrying the emperor upward toward the ceiling, as though ascending to heaven, while ambassadors stared upward in awe or fear. It was theatre, carefully orchestrated to project power the empire might not actually possess. Behind the scenes, in offices where real work was done, imperial officials managed a treasury stretched thin, juggling debts, delaying payments to troops, negotiating loans from Italian bankers. The empire survived as much by perception as by reality, by making enemies believe it was stronger than it was, by making allies think twice before betraying a power that could still command such wealth and magnificence. The diplomats in these offices spoke multiple languages: Greek, Latin, Arabic, Persian, Turkic, Slavonic. They had studied the histories and customs of every neighbouring power. They knew which barbarian chief could be bribed, which Arab emir could be played against his rivals, which Western king was greedy, which bishop could be influenced. They sent gold to enemies' enemies, married Byzantine princesses to foreign rulers, dangled the promise of trade agreements and military alliances. Every embassy that left Constantinople carried gifts, silk garments, ivory carvings, religious relics, sometimes subsidies in gold. They also carried intelligence gatherers who would learn everything they could about the powers they visited, who would report back on military strength, political divisions, economic weaknesses. Byzantine diplomacy was espionage, with silk gloves, warfare by other means. It kept the empire alive through centuries when its armies alone could not have held the borders. There's something fascinating about how the Byzantines turned weakness into strategy. Other empires, Rome, Persia, the Abbasid Caliphate, relied on military might and territorial expansion. Byzantium couldn't afford that after Justinian's plague, so they invented something different. A defensive empire that survived not by conquering, by adapting, by making enemies fight each other, by buying time with gold and promises, by defending just enough territory to sustain themselves. For 900 years after Justinian, that was enough. In 976, a new emperor took the throne. Basil II was 18 years old. For the first years of his reign, generals and courtiers assumed he would be a figurehead. They were wrong. Basil spent the next 50 years at war. His target was Bulgaria, the Slavic kingdom north of the Balkans that had raided imperial territory for generations. The campaigns were methodical, conducted in mountain passes and river valleys where supply lines stretched thin. Basil, personally, led his armies, sleeping in military camps, eating soldiers' rations. He never married, produced no heirs. Devoted his entire life to two things: prayer and war. In the mountains of the Balkans, on a cold morning in the spring of 996, the emperor sat on a camp stool outside his tent and ate hard bread dipped in watered wine. The camp smelled of wood smoke and horse dung, of wet leather from tents packed damp and unpacked the same way, of the sour smell of men who had been campaigning for months without proper baths. Basil's tent was no larger than any officer's, his bedroll no softer. He wore a soldier's padded tunic under his armour, not silk wool, practical and warm. The Bulgarian kingdom to the north had been a thorn in the empire's side for 2 centuries. The current Tsar, Samuel, was a capable commander and skilled diplomat. He had built a kingdom that stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, controlling mountain passes and river crossings the empire needed. Basil had decided to eliminate it. The campaigns were methodical, systematic, grinding. Basil did not seek glorious battles. He sought to wear down the enemy, to take fortresses one by one, to cut supply lines, to make the cost of resistance so high that eventually it would collapse. Year after year, his armies marched into Bulgarian territory. Year after year, they took towns and fortified them, built roads, established supply depots. It was not heroic. It was engineering, logistics, administration applied to war. In the year 1014, Basil won a final, crushing victory at a place called Contagion in the mountains. The Bulgarian army, perhaps 15,000 men, was cornered in a valley with no escape. They fought for a day, trying to break through Byzantine lines. When night fell, the Bulgarians laid down their weapons. What happened next became legend, though historians still debate whether the stories are true or exaggerated. The Byzantine soldiers took the Bulgarian prisoners and blinded them. Not executed, blinded them, leaving one man in every 100 with a single eye to lead the others home. The story goes that when Tsar Samuel saw his army returning, thousands of blinded men stumbling down mountain roads, led by the few who could still see, their eye sockets bandaged with fabric soaked in evidence of trauma, he collapsed. His heart failed from shock, from despair, from knowing his kingdom was finished. He perished 2 days later. Whether the story is literally true or embellished by later chroniclers who wanted to emphasize Basil's ruthlessness, the message was clear: defy Rome and suffer, resist the emperor and face such overwhelming consequences that your descendants would remember. The blinding of the Bulgarian army became one of the most infamous acts in Byzantine history, earning Basil the epithet Bulgaroktonos, the Bulgar slayer. When Basil perished in 1025, at age 67, He left instructions to be buried, not in Constantinople's great churches, in a simple tomb at a monastery he had founded, wearing not imperial purple, a monk's simple robe. The empire he left behind was at its height since Justinian's day. Borders stretched from southern Italy to Armenia, from the Danube to Syria. The treasury was full. The armies were strong. The theme system functioned smoothly. It was the last golden moment before the long descent. Basil's successors were not military men. They were administrators, courtiers, men more comfortable in the palace than in military camps. New threats were gathering at the borders, threats that would prove more dangerous than any the empire had yet faced. From the east came the Seljuk Turks, nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppes, who had converted to Islam and now pressed westward, conquering Persian lands, threatening the empire's richest provinces in Anatolia. From the west came the Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France and now carved out kingdoms in southern Italy, taking Byzantine territory piece by piece. The empire's internal politics became poisonous. The military aristocracy and civil bureaucracy fought for control, each side sabotaging the other's initiatives. The theme system began to break down as powerful landowners acquired soldier farmers' plots, turning free men into tenants, creating private armies loyal to magnates rather than the emperor. In 1071, at a place called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Byzantine army met a Seljuk Turkish force. The Emperor Romanos Diogenes led perhaps 40,000 troops. The Turkish Sultan, Alp Arslan, commanded roughly equal numbers. The battle should have been closely matched. It became a disaster. The Byzantine army's flanks, commanded by rival generals, who hated each other more than they hated the Turks, retreated without fighting, leaving the centre exposed. The emperor's Varangian guard, Viking warriors who served as imperial bodyguards, fought to the final man around him. It was not enough. Romanos was captured. The army shattered. Survivors fled west. The Turks poured into Anatolia, the empire's heartland, the source of its soldiers and much of its wealth. Within a decade, most of Anatolia was lost. The empire would never fully recover. It would endure for another 4 centuries. Never again, with the strength and confidence of Basil's reign. From Manzikert forward, Byzantium was in decline, fighting for survival, watching its territories shrink. And yet even in decline, the empire created wonders. In 1203, the Fourth Crusade was supposed to sail for Egypt. Through a tangle of debt, politics, and opportunity, the Crusaders turned aside. They sailed to Constantinople itself. The relationship between Byzantium and Western Crusaders had always been difficult. The First Crusade in 1095 had caught the Byzantine emperor by surprise. Alexios Komnenos had requested mercenary troops to help defend borders against the Turks. What arrived was a horde, tens of thousands of armed pilgrims, French knights, German foot soldiers, all streaming through Byzantine territory, consuming vast quantities of food, causing chaos. The Crusaders had taken Jerusalem in 1099, establishing kingdoms in Syria and Palestine. These kingdoms were Western in culture, Catholic in faith, feudal in organization. They had little loyalty to Constantinople. Now the Fourth Crusade, organized by Pope Innocent III, had problems. The Crusaders had contracted with Venice to transport them to Egypt. The Venetians had built a fleet ships that cost a fortune. Fewer Crusaders showed up than expected. The crusade was in debt to Venice, tens of thousands of silver marks, a sum they couldn't pay. The Venetian Doge, Enrico Dandolo, was 90 years old and blind and not inclined to forgive the debt. Dandolo had a solution. There was a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, whose father had been deposed and blinded by his uncle. This prince had fled west, seeking help to reclaim his throne. He promised that, if the Crusaders helped him, he would pay them enough to cover their debt to Venice. He would also reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches, bring Byzantium back under papal authority, and provide troops for the crusade to Egypt. It was a fantasy, a desperate lie, told by an exiled prince with no real power. The Crusaders, trapped by debt and Venetian pressure, chose to believe it. On a June morning, in 1203, the people of Constantinople woke to find the horizon filled with ships, hundreds of vessels approaching from the west, their sails marked with the cross. The great chain that protected the Golden Horn harbour was old, its iron links heavy with rust. For 700 years, it had guarded the city's northern flank. The Venetians knew these waters. They had traded here for generations. They guided the fleet past the chain through a combination of seamanship and local knowledge. The city's walls had never been breached by force. Built in the 5th century under Theodosius II, strengthened and repaired across 8 centuries, they were the greatest fortification system in the world. A triple line of defence, an outer wall 40 feet high, a second wall behind it even taller, and the original Constantinian wall forming a third line. Towers studded the defences every 50 yards. A moat 60 feet wide fronted the whole system. The Crusaders established camps outside the walls and settled in for a siege. They built siege towers, great wooden structures on wheels, tall enough to overlook the walls. They constructed trebuchets, stone-throwing engines that could hurl half-ton rocks. Inside the city, politics consumed the imperial court. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, was incompetent and corrupt. His nephew, the Alexios Angelos, who had brought the Crusaders, was allowed to enter the city. The emperor fled, taking what treasure he could carry. The Crusaders placed young Alexios on the throne, crowning him as Alexios IV. The young emperor couldn't fulfill his promises. The treasury was empty. His uncle had looted it before fleeing. The Orthodox Church refused to submit to Rome. The Crusaders grew angry, demanding their payment, threatening violence. Tensions rose through the winter. In January, a fire broke out in the city, started by Westerners or Greeks. Accounts differ, and burned for days, destroying entire neighbourhoods, leaving thousands without shelter. In February, a palace coup overthrew and eliminated young Alexios. A new emperor, Alexios V Ducas, took power and declared he would pay the Crusaders nothing. He ordered them to leave. They refused. The assault began in April of 1204. For 3 days, the Crusaders threw everything they had against the land walls. The walls held. They had held against Persians and Avars, against Arabs and Bulgars, against every enemy that had tried to take the city for 800 years. On April 13th, the Crusaders changed tactics. Instead of attacking the land walls, they attacked from the sea, bringing their ships against the seawall that protected the city's northern flank along the Golden Horn. The defences here were weaker. The Venetians were expert sailors, able to manoeuvre their ships close to walls, using masts as scaling ladders, extending boarding ramps from ships' decks to the top of the wall. The breakthrough came at midday. Venetian sailors gained the top of the seawall at several points. Byzantine defenders fought them hand to hand. The Crusaders kept coming. More ships arriving. That may podifixinasist comes sino. More men climbing. Once they had a foothold on the wall, they pushed inland, opening gates, allowing their comrades to pour through. By evening, a significant portion of the city was in Crusader hands. Emperor Alexios V fled, following his predecessor, into exile. The city was leaderless. For 3 days, the Crusaders occupied and plundered Constantinople. What followed was one of the great crimes of the Middle Ages, a betrayal so complete that it stained the reputation of the crusading movement forever. Poisoned relations between Catholic West and Orthodox East for centuries, destroyed irreplaceable treasures. The Crusaders broke into churches, the holiest places in Christendom, after Jerusalem itself, and stripped them for plunder. The Hagia Sophia, Justinian's masterpiece, was ransacked. Soldiers damaged the altar screen, looking for gold hidden inside. They tore down the silver iconostasis that separated the nave from the sanctuary. They pried loose the gold and silver revetment that covered the columns. A woman from the harbour trades, according to one horrified Greek chronicler, sat on the patriarch's throne, singing bawdy songs while soldiers drank communion wine from chalices. Relics that had survived since the empire's conversion to Christianity were stolen or destroyed. The crown of thorns, preserved in Constantinople since the 4th century, was taken. Pieces of the true cross, fragments of saints' bones, icons painted by St. Luke himself, according to tradition, all looted. Some sold to Western churches, others melted down for their precious metal. Libraries burned. Manuscripts that had survived for 1,000 years went up in smoke, or were destroyed by soldiers who couldn't read Greek and saw only paper for kindling. Houses were broken into. Civilians were not spared. Elderly priests were subjected to coercive measures for the location of hidden treasures. The streets witnessed severe violence. The Crusaders established a Latin empire in the wreckage, a feudal kingdom that lasted barely 60 years. A Flemish count became emperor, sitting on Constantine's throne, ruling from the great palace whose treasures had been divided among Western knights like spoils of war. The real Byzantine Empire had not perished. The court fled to Nicaea, a city in northwestern Anatolia, and there established a government in exile. For 60 years they waited, watched, planned. In 1261, a Byzantine army retook Constantinople. The emperor, Michael VIII Palaiologos, entered the city through the Golden Gate, the triumphal entrance reserved for military victories, and was crowned in the Hagia Sophia. The Latin Empire collapsed. The Byzantine Empire had returned. It had returned to ruins. The population was gone, casualties, scattered, fled to other cities. The great forums were empty, their columns toppled. Weeds grew in the hippodrome. The great palace was uninhabitable, its mosaics torn from walls for their gold, its roof fallen in. The imperial court moved to the Blackenay Palace in the city's northwest corner, a smaller complex that could be maintained with reduced resources. The empire that reclaimed Constantinople was a shadow, controlling only fragments of territory western Anatolia, parts of Greece, some Aegean islands. It was bankrupt, dependent on Italian loans at usurious rates. Genoa and Venice controlled its trade, their colonies in the city enjoying extraterritorial rights, paying no taxes, growing rich on Byzantine commerce, while the Byzantine treasury remained empty. Even in diminished state, the culture endured. Monasteries continued their work, copying manuscripts in scriptoriums lit by oil lamps. Monks scratched away with quill pens, preserving the learning of antiquity, Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's philosophy, Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy. Medical texts by Galen and Hippocrates. All the knowledge of ancient Greece that Western Europe had lost during its own dark ages, Byzantium had preserved through centuries of war and plague and invasion. In a monastery in Mistras, a Byzantine town in southern Greece, far from the ruined capital, a monk named George Gemistos bent over a manuscript in the year 1390. The scriptorium was cold winter in the Peloponnese brought rain and wind that found every crack in stone walls. His fingers were stiff, making it difficult to hold the quill properly. He continued his work, copying a text of Plato's Republic that had come to the monastery from Constantinople decades earlier. The vellum was expensive, made from calf skin that had been scraped and stretched and smoothed with pumice stone. Each page represented hours of labour and considerable cost. Gemistos worked carefully, forming each Greek letter with precision, his years of practice making his hand steady despite the cold. When he made a mistake, he scraped it away with a knife and continued. There was no waste here. No room for carelessness. The empire was ending. Everyone knew it, though no one said it aloud in public. The territories had shrunk to almost nothing, Constantinople and its immediate environs, a few towns in Greece, some islands in the Aegean. The Ottomans controlled everything else, encircling the empire like a python, slowly tightening its coils. Here, in this cold room lit by expensive candles, Gemistos was saving civilization. He was not alone. Across what remained of the empire, in monasteries and private libraries, scholars continued their work. They copied ancient texts, wrote commentaries, debated philosophy and theology in letters that travelled by ship between the scattered Byzantine holdings. They were the last custodians of a tradition that stretched back through 15 centuries to ancient Athens, through Rome's rise and fall, through Christianity's spread, through plague and invasion, and the slow erosion of empire. We tend to think of the Renaissance as a purely Italian phenomenon, sparked by rediscovered classical texts. The reality is more complex. Those texts were never lost. They were being copied and studied in Byzantine scriptoriums, while Western Europe struggled through its dark ages. When the empire finally fell, Byzantine scholars carried those manuscripts west to Italian cities where wealthy patrons supported learning, where printing would soon make books cheaper and more available. Byzantine twilight met Western dawn, and knowledge passed like a torch from those who could no longer hold it to those who could. In Constantinople, in the Church of the Holy Saviour in Cora, mosaicists worked through the summer of 1320, creating some of the most beautiful religious art the world had ever seen. The church was small, a monastery church, not one of the great imperial foundations. Its patron, Theodore Metachites, was wealthy and cultured, the empire's chief administrator. He poured his fortune into decorating this church, as though beauty alone could hold back the darkness gathering outside the walls. The mosaics covered every surface: walls, vaults, domes, not the stern, frontal icons of earlier Byzantine art, something softer, more human, more emotionally expressive. Christ's mother Mary, shown as a young woman being presented at the temple, walked up steps toward the priest while her parents watched. The mosaic showed her movement, the fold of her dress, the tenderness in her parents' faces. The tessera, tiny cubes of glass and gold leaf, were placed in wet plaster by artisans who had trained since their youth in the craft. Each cube was set at a slightly different angle, catching light from different directions, making the surfaces shimmer as viewers moved through the space. The gold backgrounds weren't flat-textured, undulating, creating the impression of divine light filling the air around the sacred figures. This was Byzantine art's final flowering, created in an empire that controlled barely more territory than a single province had held in better days, created while Ottoman armies pressed closer each year, created as an act of defiance or faith, or simply because beauty mattered, even at the end. By 1400, the empire consisted of little more than the city itself and a few towns in Greece. The Ottomans controlled everything else: Asia Minor, the Balkans, most of the Black Sea coast. Constantinople was an island in an Ottoman sea. The walls still stood beyond them. The world had changed. In 1451, a new Ottoman sultan took power. Mehmed II was 19 years old. He wanted Constantinople with an obsession that consumed him. He spent 2 years preparing. Fortresses were built on the Bosporus to control sea traffic. Alliances were made with Italian city-states. And cannons were cast enormous bronze weapons that could throw stone balls weighing half a ton. In the bronze foundries outside Edion, the Ottoman capital 60 miles west of Constantinople, a Hungarian engineer named Urban supervised the casting of the largest cannon ever built. The year was 1452. The foundry was a scene from hell. Furnaces roared day and night, fed with charcoal and bellows. Heating bronze to liquid form a mixture of copper and tin that glowed orange-white in crucibles. The heat was immense, making air shimmer, forcing workers to approach the furnaces in short bursts, their faces wrapped in wet cloth. The odour of hot metal and burning charcoal hung thick enough to taste. The cannon taking shape was massive. Its barrel would be 27 feet long, its bore 30 inches wide, capable of throwing a stone ball weighing 1,300 pounds. When fired, this ball could shatter medieval fortifications, punch through walls that had resisted siege engines for a millennium. Urban had offered his services to the Byzantines first. He was a cannon founder, a specialist in the new science of artillery. He knew Constantinople needed modern weapons. The emperor had no money to pay him. The Ottoman Sultan did. So Urban crossed to the other side, his knowledge and skill now aimed at destroying the city he had offered to defend. In April of 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before Constantinople's walls. The siege lines stretched for miles, camps of soldiers surrounding the city on its landward side, ships blockading the harbours. The Byzantine defenders numbered perhaps 7,000, including Genoese and Venetian volunteers who had stayed to fight. Emperor Constantine XI walked the walls personally, organising the defence, assigning sectors to commanders, speaking words of encouragement to soldiers who knew they would likely perish. The cannons began their work on April 12th. The bombardment started at dawn, the sound of cannon fire echoing across the city, across the Bosporus, audible for miles. Urban's great cannon fired 7 times a day its maximum rate, as it had to cool between shots. Each time it fired, the ground shook. The ball flew toward the walls like a meteor, struck with crushing force, and shattered. The impact cracked stone that had stood for 1,000 years. The Theodosian walls began to crumble. Stone blocks loosened in their joints, fell from the top of the walls, created gaps. The defenders worked at night to repair the damage, piling rubble into breaches, reinforcing weak sections with timbers and earth. Each day, the cannons resumed. Slowly, inexorably, the walls failed. Inside the city, people prayed. The Hagia Sophia filled with worshippers every day, Orthodox and Catholic together for the first time in centuries. The schism no longer mattered. Doctrinal disputes about the nature of the Trinity, about papal authority, none of it mattered anymore. Only survival mattered. The Virgin Mary had saved the city before. Surely she would not abandon her city now. As April turned to May, and the cannons continued their work, and Ottoman assault troops moved closer to the walls, hope began to fade. Constantine knew the end was near. On the evening of May 28th, he addressed his commanders in the throne room at Blakeney. He asked them to keep fighting, to remember the city's glory, to honour their ancestors who had defended these walls. He reminded them they fought not just for empire, for Christianity itself, for the faith that had sustained the empire since Constantine I's vision 1100 years ago. Then he dismissed them and walked alone through the palace, through rooms where emperors had ruled since the city's founding. He walked to the Hagia Sophia, attended liturgy one final time, took communion, and returned to the walls. The assault came at dawn on May 29th. Waves of Ottoman soldiers threw themselves at the broken walls. The defenders, exhausted from 2 months of siege, fighting on little sleep and less food, held them back through desperate courage. For hours the battle raged along the walls. Ottoman soldiers climbed ladders, were repulsed, climbed again. Eventually something had to give. Around dawn, a small sallyport in the wall called the Kirke Porta was found unlocked, left open by accident or sabotage. Historians still debate. Ottoman soldiers poured through. Once they were inside, the defence collapsed. Ottoman troops spread through the streets. Some defenders fell back to make final stands in churches and fortified buildings. Others fled toward the harbours. Most simply perished where they stood. Constantine perished fighting somewhere near the walls. Accounts differ on the exact location and manner of his final moments. Some say he fell defending a breach, surrounded by enemies, sword in hand. Others say he removed his imperial regalia so he could fall as a simple soldier. His body was never positively identified. A man who might have been Constantine was found among the fallen near the street. Romanos Gate, identified by purple boots he wore. This could have been anyone. By midday, the city had fallen. On the afternoon of May 29th, Sultan Mehmed II entered Constantinople on horseback, riding through streets still littered with evidence of battle, past burning buildings, through the wreckage of empire. He was 21 years old. He had conquered the city that had resisted sieges for 1,000 years. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. The great church stood silent, its doors broken open. Mehmed dismounted at the entrance and entered on foot, a gesture of respect before God. Inside, the vast space echoed with his footsteps. Light still poured through the windows at the dome's base, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. Mehmed walked to the centre of the nave, beneath the dome that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, and knelt. He scooped a handful of dust from the marble floor and poured it over his head, a traditional gesture of humility, acknowledging that even conquest and glory were temporary. Then he stood and declared that the Hagia Sophia would become a mosque, that Constantinople, which he would rename Istanbul, would be the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine Empire was over. Rome had finally fallen, 1477 years after Augustus became its first emperor, 1123 years after Constantine founded the eastern capital. The legacy remained, scattered across Europe like seeds from a dying plant, taking root in unexpected places. Byzantine scholars fled west, carrying manuscripts tucked under their arms, their heads full of knowledge the West had forgotten. They found employment in Italian cities, Florence, Venice, Rome, where wealthy patrons supported learning. Cardinal Bessarion, a Byzantine bishop who had converted to Catholicism, brought 500 manuscripts to Venice, the foundation of the Marciana Library. Other scholars brought fewer equally precious texts, the only surviving copies of works by ancient authors. The texts they brought helped spark the Renaissance. Without Byzantine preservation, much of ancient Greek philosophy would have been lost forever. Aristotle would be known only through fragments, Plato through summaries, Euclid's geometry, Archimedes' mathematics, Galen's medicine, all might have vanished. The law codes Justinian had compiled in the 6th century remain the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Roman law traditions that continue today in continental Europe, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, all trace their ancestry to Justinian's codification. Lawyers still reference his principles, still study cases analysed by Byzantine jurists. The artistic traditions of Byzantium spread through Orthodox Christianity and beyond. Russian icons follow Byzantine style. Romanian frescoes in painted monasteries, Serbian mosaics, Greek iconography, all carry forward the visual language Byzantium created. And the buildings remain. The Hagia Sophia still stands in Istanbul, its dome still defying gravity after 1500 years. In Ravenna, on Italy's Adriatic coast, Byzantine mosaics still cover the walls of San Vitale and Sant'Apollinare. The colours remain vivid after 15 centuries. The deep blue backgrounds, the gold that catches light, the green of Emperor Justinian's courtiers' robes. Visitors can stand in these spaces and see exactly what 6th century Byzantines saw. The walls of Constantinople, though battered and broken in many places, still ring the old city. You can walk them today, climb the towers, stand where Constantine XI stood on his final morning, look out at the same sea. Byzantine soldiers watched for enemy fleets. In monasteries on Mount Athos in northern Greece, monks still copy manuscripts using techniques Byzantine scribes perfected. The script, the illumination, the binding, all follow traditions passed down through generations, unbroken chains of craft and knowledge that stretch back 1,000 years. Tonight we have followed Byzantium from Constantine's vision to Constantine's final stand, from the founding of a new Rome to its last defense. We have watched an empire that survived for 1,000 years after the real Rome collapsed, an empire that preserved civilization through dark ages in the West, an empire that adapted and endured through plague and invasion and slow erosion. The Western world nearly forgot it, dismissing it with the word Byzantine used as an insult meaning complex, labyrinthine, decadent. It was Roman, always Roman. Its emperors claimed unbroken succession from Augustus. Its laws were Roman law. Its citizens called themselves Romaioi, Romans until the very end. The empire that history books say fell in 476 did not fall. It moved east, it transformed, it survived another millennium. When it finally ended, it left an inheritance that shaped the world we inhabit today. Walk through Istanbul, and you walk through layers of empire, Ottoman palaces, built on Byzantine foundations, mosques that were churches, walls that defended against centuries of siege. The city remembers, in Ravenna's mosaics, in Venice's libraries, in Greek monasteries, in legal codes and liturgies and philosophical traditions. Byzantium endures. The purple silk is gone, the mechanical throne is gone, the Greek fire recipe is lost, the stones remain, memory remains. The knowledge Byzantium preserved continues to shape how we think and how we live. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the empire that refused to end. If you walk beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, remember that once this was the centre of the world, the wealthiest city on earth, the place where Rome survived its apparent demise. Until our next exploration into the quiet past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.